This week in France, an important trial started, a trial of 15 suspected terrorists behind the shocking attacks 5 years ago on the staff of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical newspaper, and also then on a Jewish kosher market. 17 people were murdered, including journalists and cartoonists whose sin, according to the terrorists, was just drawing cartoons of Mohammed. The killers themselves were killed in the attacks. Those on trial are accused of financing or otherwise helping them, and many are being tried in absentia. So why is this important? Well, it's important because we can date now precisely when most of our elite expose themselves as utter hypocrites, as people posing on the occasion as defenders of free speech before selling out yours. Now, you may remember at the time of those murders, the reaction here, the big protests in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, defending free speech, and many protesters holding up signs and chanting the big slogan of those protests, Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie, in solidarity, free speech and all that. I said at the time, they lied. They weren't going to defend free speech. They weren't Charlie Hebdo at all. The magazine would have been insulted by the presence of people like that. These were people who wanted to pose as defenders of free speech with all the cameras on them and all the heightened emotions, all the backslapping. They wanted to defend free speech, sure, in principle, but they did not want to risk a thing to actually defend it themselves. And they sure weren't going to defend the free speech of anybody they didn't like. In fact, the very opposite, as we have seen. This week, at the start of this trial, Charlie Hebdo ran a front page republishing the cartoons for which its staff had died, with the headline, "All that for this?" Needless to say, not one Australian newspaper has done the same. In fact, none, except one by accident, published the cartoons at the time either. Too dangerous, too inflammatory. Our staff might get hurt. And so we have let ourselves be censored, bit by bit. And it goes beyond that, of course, because we've seen a general contempt now for the free speech of others. We saw that very spectacularly this week with the handcuffing and arrest of a pregnant woman in her home, in front of her children, in her pyjamas, can you believe it, for advertising a protest against the Victorian government's cruel lockdown laws, which happen to be backed by most of the media. Again, what happened to free speech? Oh, it's too dangerous. It's a health hazard. Shut her down. Arrest her in her gym jams. In fact, even Parliament is deemed a health hazard now. I find it staggering that sessions of our federal and Victorian parliaments could have been cancelled on health advice and MPs warned to stay away, rostered on only, even when it does sit. People once died fighting for democracy and for free speech. Now politicians who have these things in their hands run away, scared off by a virus. Now Victoria's police? What do they care about mere constitutional arguments and issues like free speech when they're busy crushing protests?
The tinfoil hat wearing brigade are alive and well out there in our community, and they're taking every opportunity to leverage the current situation to serve their own ridiculous notions about so-called sovereign citizens, about constitutional issues, and about how 5G is going to kill your grandkids. I mean, it's just crazy. It's crazy nonsense.
Beware of the policeman filled with righteous indignation. Didn't we see that with other police who prosecuted George Pell, Cardinal George Pell, charged him with 26 cases of child sexual abuse, every one of which was so weak they fell over. But they were so convinced they were right. Now, I know this bloke and the police generally in Victoria have got to administer the law, act on the laws that were set for them by this dictatorial Daniel Andrews' government. They have to go and arrest protesters, but I think a little less contempt for the protesters and their rights might suit this man a lot better. And in fact, beyond all this is that wider contempt for the free speech of others. Je suis Charlie, they chanted in defence of the French cartoonist safely on the other side of the world. But Australian cartoonist, not so much. When the great Bill Leak of the Australian newspaper drew a cartoon drawing attention to the terrible rates of child neglect and abuse in some Aboriginal communities, he was smashed by many journalists. He was hounded by the Human Rights Commission so badly, persecuted, that his family blames that stress for the heart attack that killed him. And when his son, Johannes, also now with the Australian, last month mocked the racism of the left's Joe Biden, the tokenist race politics that he plays, former Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd actually boasted that he'd reported Leak to the Press Council for punishment. The intolerance for free speech is now astonishing. It's especially so when you dare criticise the dangerous new tribalism, the race baiting of the left, the laws now, the censorship, the activist judges, plus the Australian Press Council. What a joke that is. It is astonishing. And of course, the people who oversee the speech police of television, appalling. Plus, out there, so many on the left deplatforming people they don't like, running scare campaigns to terrify advertisers from running ads on 2GB or shows like this one. Anyone that dare still has a conservative, we've got to silence them. Or dumping writers like Germaine Greer, even Germaine Greer, from writers' festivals here for not saying the right thing about transsexuals. Or the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, stripping Barry Humphries' name from its top awards, that genius Barry Humphries, because he said the wrong thing about transsexuals too. Can't have that. Or how about James Cook University firing one of its professors, a dean no less, for pointing out exaggerations by global warming extremists at that university? Don't answer him, silence him. And now Twitter and Facebook, removing posts around the world by doctors saying they've tried hydroxychloroquine, a drug unfortunately backed by Donald Trump, that's why it's hated. They've backed hydroxychloroquine. They've tried it on virus patients and they report it works. Censor them. Can't have Donald Trump proved right. And the violence now. We have already seen riots right here by the left, people like Antifa, to shut down speeches by libertarians and conservatives, Milo Yiannopoulos, Pauline Hanson, opponents of same-sex marriage, Geert Wilders, Corey Bernardi, and more. Antifa bozos attacked me in the street outside a book launch. How symbolic. Because they don't like what I say, so let's just, attack him. But not try that again, cobbers. Well, look now at the Black Lives Matter protesters in the United States trying to shut down debate, terrify opponents into silence, not with better arguments, which is legitimate and the best and healthiest and safest way to go. Not with arguments, but with violence and intimidation. Those protesters haven't just murdered and bashed Trump supporters. They have this week turned on Democrat mayors even. They've turned on their own mayors they don't think are supportive enough of their antics, shooting fireworks at the apartment of the mayor of Portland to scare him and his family, and defacing the home of the mayor of San Jose. And what I don't get, what I can't forgive, is the silence of so many on the left. They're so loud. Oh, civil liberties, provided they're of, perhaps illegal immigrants. Civil liberties. Never quiet when it comes to that. But when it comes to the left shutting down with violence and intimidation, conservatives, nothing. Nothing. Je suis Charlie. I knew they were lying. In fact, the terrorists won. Because so many on the left, people like Antifa, they looked, they learned, they saw that terrorism works, and the great silencing has begun.